And that's probably a good thing to remind us of right now as we head in more and more into the New Testament. This whole thing about having the Old Testament and the New Testament sometimes I feel can be a really unhelpful dichotomy, all right? Some people grow up believing, well, the Old Testament's written to Hebrews, the New Testament, that's written to Christians. That's the one that's for us. No. Listen, it's the same book, okay? And the same rules apply when reading it. As we read through the Hebrew part of the Bible, we saw figures of speech, poetry, prophecy that was not meant to be taken literally. Well, guess what? The same rule applies for the new, okay? We're going to see the same thing. We're going to see prophetic language, poetic language, and figures of speech being employed, many of them borrowed from the Hebrew Bible, of course, because that's the tradition and the culture that they have. The point is, the same rules apply. The same rules apply looking at who the audience is that is being addressed. This was a massive thing we saw through the Old Testament. Sometimes the prophets speak to the northern kingdom, sometimes they speak to the south, sometimes they spoke to Egypt or to the Philistines or to Babylon or to Edom. Okay, different audiences being addressed for different purposes. Well, guess what? When we come to the New Testament, same rule applies, okay? Not everything written in the New Testament was written to Christians. Even the words that Jesus speaks in red, many of them were not written to Christian people. In fact, you could probably say none of them were spoken to Christians because Christians don't even exist until Acts chapter 2. You can't be a Christian until after Jesus has died for sins. You can't be born again until the Holy Spirit's poured out. So even as we read through the Gospels, please don't think everything that Jesus is teaching in the Gospels is for a Christian audience. No. Pay attention. Sometimes Jesus is speaking to religious people, and particularly Jewish Old Covenant leaders. Sometimes he's speaking to Gentile people. Sometimes he's speaking to his followers. We always need to pay attention to the audience. The same rule applies, all right? It's the same Bible, it's the same story, and the same rules apply throughout it. You can, in my estimation, I think you can basically ignore that page that says New Testament that the editors put in, okay? God didn't put it there. There's a 400-year gap between Malachi and Matthew, but God never said that's the start of the New Testament. That's just what our editors did to make it what they think's helpful. I think it actually is probably not helpful at all because it splits our Bible and it splits people's mindset as to the fact that they're reading two different books. No, you're not. It is the same story. It is the same book, and we need to apply the same rules of reading it as we do all the way from the beginning. All right? All right, that's a bit of a rant. Let's get into Mark's Gospel this week. That was all for free. I'll get off my hobby horse now. Okay, never mind. Mark's Gospel is a lot shorter than Matthew, so you'll be relieved to know that. In fact, it's about half the size, and about 90% of what we see in Mark we've already read in Matthew last week. So it's going to seem quite repetitive, but still pay attention because there's some great gems in there for you. As with all the Gospels, the author is anonymous, okay? When we come to the letters of the New Testament, it's customary for people to introduce themselves. Paul, an apostle, blah, blah, blah. But with the Gospels, it's a story, okay? It's written as a story, and the author never self-identifies. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John get their names because of church tradition that says who wrote them. So traditionally, it's been believed that John Mark, who was a companion of Peter, wrote this Gospel and primarily wrote it to a Greek audience, a non-Jewish audience, and we kind of pick that up because every now and again he'll explain a certain Jewish tradition, whereas if he was writing to Jewish people like Matthew was, he wouldn't really have to do that, okay? So it's a much shorter Gospel, as I said, and that's great for those of us who just want to get to the point. Okay, some of you are watching this video now saying, Chad, just get to the point. Well, here it is. Matthew gives a lot of detail on things, and Mark just gets straight down to the nuts and bolts of it. And while he tells the same stories, the same parables, the same healings, the same people, the same predictions, like the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. You know, Matthew spends 2 or 3 whole chapters on that. Mark just gives a couple of paragraphs, gets straight to the point. So he's a very succinct writer. And also he writes with a real sense of immediacy. You're going to really pick this up in the first chapter, where you're going to read the terms, suddenly, or immediately, or at once, or just then. It's like Mark really wants to move the story forward, and so it has quite a different feel to it than what Matthew did. But it is similar in another way, in that basically the first half of the book is devoted to Jesus' life and ministry up in the country areas, Galilee, Capernaum, Nazareth, and that type of space, all right? Basically up bush where there's farmers and fishermen. It's only in the second half of the book that Jesus comes down to Jerusalem, which is basically because he is going to the cross. And so Matthew, Mark, and Luke all follow a similar pattern like that, and that's why they're traditionally called the Synoptic Gospels. They have the same synopsis, okay, basically, which is where that word comes from. John, very different, and we'll have a look at him before too long. All right, anyway, there's a few things about Mark's Gospel I really picked up this week. Keep your eye out for them, and hopefully this helps you as you read Mark this week. The first thing is Mark constantly references Jesus being followed by large crowds, whether he's on a mountainside or a synagogue or his own house or somebody else's house. It doesn't just say that crowds followed him. Mark says large crowds followed him and pressed around him. Now this kind of makes sense if Mark was written to Greek people outside of Judah who didn't actually see Jesus in the flesh. You know, Mark wants them to know, listen, when Jesus was around, a lot of people saw him. This isn't just some small story who had a guy who had a small following. There was huge amounts of people, multitudes of people that witnessed the things I'm telling you about. So possibly that's why he emphasizes that. Yet the second thing that's interesting, while on one hand he had large crowds, the second thing to notice is that Jesus constantly tells people to keep his ministry quiet. Like he'll heal someone and then he'll say, shh, don't tell anyone, all right? Don't tell anyone that a miracle has just transformed your life. Please don't tell anyone about it. You'll just see this over and over again. It's a really strange thing. There is one exception to that rule though, which gives us a bit of a clue as to why Jesus might do it. Jesus goes on a boat and heals a guy who has a whole lot of demons, the Legion and the whole pig story, that whole thing. And when he heals that guy, he says to him, now listen, you go to your own people and tell everyone. Tell all of your own people. But then every time Jesus heals someone on the other side of the lake, he says, don't tell anyone, don't tell anyone, don't tell anyone. And so it's quite possible that what Jesus is doing here, knowing that he is going to be killed by his own people and rejected by his own Jewish people, he's not trying to big note himself. When he heals Jewish people, okay, when he's in a Jewish environment, he says, listen, please keep this to yourself. Just keep this quiet. When he's with a guy, a Gentile in a whole other area, yeah, tell anyone you want. I don't care. Tell everyone. So there's maybe a bit of a mix there. In fact, sometimes he even warns people not to tell, like as if there's going to be real bad consequences if they spread the news about their miracle. Just a real interesting thing, okay? Number one, big crowds. Number two, a big secret. Jesus is trying to be discreet in his ministry, particularly around Jewish people. And the last thing that I noticed this week is how Jesus, amidst all the crowd ministry that he's had, would often try to pull his disciples into him privately and have private, quiet words with them. And the most obvious example of this is when he's teaching the crowds in parables. And then he brings his disciples to him privately and he said, listen, I'm going to reveal the mysteries or the secret. It's the same word Paul uses over and over again in his epistles. The mystery of the kingdom of God to you. But to those on the outside, to those crowds on the outside, I speak in parables. And he quotes Isaiah 6. He says, I speak in parables because while they love to listen, they will never hear. While they love to look, they will never actually see. And again, as I encouraged you last week, if you read a New Testament passage quoting the Old, go back and read it in its original context. When Isaiah said that in chapter 6, he was talking to the northern kingdom and he says, I'm speaking to you in parables because even though I'm prophesying, you're not actually listening. And he said, because you won't listen, the Assyrian army will come in and destroy you. And it seems that that's what Jesus is doing here. A lot of preachers say Jesus spoke in parables to help people understand what he was saying. Well, that's not what the gospel says. He says he spoke in parables to people who would refuse to listen. And like Israel, northern kingdom that was taken out by the Assyrians, as we know, he prophesies the people Jesus was speaking to, the people on the outside, would eventually be taken out by the Romans in a very, very similar and parallel situation. Sadly, but it's true, and we know that Jesus predicts that again here in Mark's Gospel with the destruction of Jerusalem coming sometime in the future. All right, so what's your point, Chad? Get to the point. All right, the point is he has big crowds. He's always telling people, shh, don't tell people about me. And the third thing is, he pulls his disciples together to himself to tell them secret things that he doesn't tell the crowds. All right? There you go. So it's an interesting thing to note that while this gospel is primarily written to Gentiles, there are still Old Testament quotes in there. So maybe being a shorter gospel this week, you can do what I encourage you and have a look at some of those quotes in the Old Testament. Because again, it is one book that we're reading. Hebrew Bible, Greek Bible, first century scriptures, Hebrew Bible. It's the one book we're reading, and it has a continual narrative. All right. So enjoy Mark this week. 16 chapters. You should be able to do it pretty easy. Now, before I go, one last thing. Next week, we are supposed to be reading Luke, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But I actually want to mix that up, okay? What I want to do is I want to read John next week and then Luke. One of the reasons for that is, as I said, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are all pretty well the same. So it's going to get repetitive. It'd be good to throw John in there just to mix it up a bit. But that's not the main reason. This is the main reason. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts. Luke and Acts are written by the same person, and it's basically a continuation book, a little bit like Ezra to Nehemiah. Okay, so I think it's actually going to be more helpful for us to see that continuation if we read Luke and Acts together. All right, what's the point? Matthew, Mark, John, Luke and Acts. If you can head into that, or I'll just give you a warning as to what's going to happen next week. I'm going to do a video on John. Bless you guys. Oh, 13 minutes. It's way too long. I should be more to the point like Mark. Bless you guys. Have a good read, and I'll see you next week for John's Gospel, the fourth Gospel. Bye.
That's it for today's lesson. I really hope you enjoy your readings this week. Remember, allow yourself time to read as much as you can in one sitting. Don't get lost in the detail. Just keep going and watch the Bible's big story unfold before you. Remember also to hit me up on our social media channels or website, and I'll see you next time.